Welcome and aloha. Thanks for joining us at ThinkTech Hawaii. Glad to have you with us. Glad to have you back. And we're going to take up something that's gotten a little bit of a back burner to the economy and immigration and some other issues, but not just for the long term, but for the short term. Hopefully for all of us, it should be as important as anything on our agenda, and that's education. Where are we? What's broken? What needs to be fixed? Where do we go? How do we approach it? And we have with us David Larson, professor at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, recent past chair of the American Bar Association section of dispute resolution, conflict resolver, innovator, educator, and more, as you'll see. David, welcome aboard.
Well, hi, nice to see you.
You've been plugged into our problematic education system for many years, as have I. What do you see as the things that are most broken right now?
It's hard to
maybe a long list. It may not be enough for our half hour.
It's hard to prioritize. I think one of the things as an educator, I'm concerned about is censorship. And this trend that's spreading across the country like a wildfire of aggressive efforts to censor the material that's available to students. And it's starting to reach unimaginable extremes, at least from my perspective. I think a good example of that is legislation now about drag performances. It's like, that's, given all the things happening in the world, that's what you're going to spend your time legislating, is prohibiting drag performances. And you look at some of the legislation, says things like, 14 states, 23 bills, just this year alone, to say that we're going to prohibit on public school grounds any dress makeup that is not consistent with the gender that was assigned to someone at their birth. And I was looking at some of these statutes and some of this legislation, and the West Virginia one in particular is, I think, troubling. It prohibits, if you look at SB 252, it prohibits any transvested or transgender exposure. I'm going to wait there for a second. Exposure, performance or display within 2,500 feet of a public school. I mean, that is so broad. That means a parent or a student can't attend any performance at all if they're transgender. They're prohibited. So it isn't just performance. If you're writing the legislation that broadly, you're going to be cutting people out of the environment. Absolutely. And that is especially troubling.
So, it sounds like this is an all-out assault. It's not just political, but moral, and it seems to be narrowing quickly, aggressively, and extensively. Not just what people can talk about, but what they can think about in the educational process. Where is this coming from? We know, politically where it's coming from, but where in our society and our history, our human environment is this coming from?
Yeah, and for me, it's a little bit of speculation. But I think it's a begrudging realization that our demographics of our country are changing, and that values may be changing, and that instead of being perceived as an opportunity to maybe have even a broader view of life and better appreciation of what's out there, it's viewed as a threat. And the idea is that we've got to make sure it doesn't go any further. We've got to shut things down and, in fact, maybe even roll things back. So I think part of it's coming from this fear that the world's changing and I don't feel like I can control it, but I'm going to make my best effort, and I'm going to hit it on many different fronts. And I don't want change. In fact, I would even like to go back to some imagined reality that maybe I was enjoying before. So at least from my perspective, I think that's one of the motivations.
Well, and that's an important insight, David, because it's an indication that it's coming from a very zero-sum game perspective, that the only way the group that has the most gets to keep what they got is to make sure that those who have less continue to get less. And in fact, to move that needle even farther in the direction of widening that gap.
Yeah, so it's very disappointing. Um, I think it's incumbent on all of us to pay attention to what's happening. Um, Bills are being introduced as a tsunami. Um, we need to know what's happening in our state legislatures. We need to make sure we know what our elected representatives are doing. I think most of us need to be more active than we were before. We just can't let things happen. Um, there's been things written about bookstores, for example, that bookstores aren't being aggressive enough about pushing back, um, uh, talking about local communities and the reluctance to get involved with school boards. Takes too much time. It's fractious and troubling, and I don't want to get involved in the controversy. Um, so all of those things are kind of used as explanations as to why I can't get involved. But I think we're at the point in which we need to get involved. And even though there might be some obstacles and disincentives, we're at the time at which we really need to push back, and we need to do it visibly.
Well, and it's scary because together with the censorship, the restriction that reinforces and empowers the very biases and oppression and marginalization that cause these gaps in everything, education, jobs, healthcare, across the board. Together with those have come not just discouragement, not just censorship rules, but very, very punitive enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, Florida says it's a felony. Um, so what are the implications of that? Um, in Minnesota, governor just signed a bill restoring voting rights to people that had committed felonies and had served their time and were released from prison. But I don't know the situation in Florida. I wouldn't be surprised if in many states, anybody that has a felony on their record suddenly can't vote. So that's only one of the consequences of violating these prohibitive laws. And the problem with many of them is they're written so vaguely that you're not quite sure what that line is. I mean, what can I do and what can't I do? And the consequence of that is that you're going to self-censor. You're going to say that I don't really want a felony. I don't want to lose my job. I've got kids that I've got to take care of. I got a mortgage, so I can't even approach the line. There's certain things I'm just not going to talk about anymore, and that's really the threat is that the self-censorship will be so broad that there's subjects that won't even be broached. They'll just be eliminated in discussion.
No, and just picking one example at random, if you look at Florida legislation that it's passed to essentially disenfranchise virtually everyone who has not only had any kind of criminal conviction, but they've completed their sentence. They're supposed to be back in society and rehabilitating and reentering, but they've imposed this all fines payment as a condition to voting. And how is that not a poll tax? I don't know.
Yeah, and you think about the kids in school. So let's say you're transgendered. How can you possibly feel comfortable in a school that doesn't even permit any kind of discussion about you, and in fact prohibits and criminalizes it? And how can you learn in that school system? How can you be comfortable? It's really pretty frightening. And as a parent, I think it would be extremely frightening to know that my kid is in that environment and has those kinds of threats and branding going on.
And that helps us understand that what's available and possible for young people, for students to be able to learn, and for teachers to be able to teach and explore. The whole learning process gets completely short-circuited if you do that.
Yeah, everyone's talking about Florida now, but a lot of states are following Florida's lead. Florida had their Don't Say Gay bill, also called a Parental Rights and Education bill. But basically, they're saying no classroom instruction about sexual orientation or gender identity in grades K through 3 or thereafter, if not age or developmentally appropriate. What does that mean? 10 states since Florida have introduced similar bills with greater prohibitions. 10 of those bills are prohibiting any of those kinds of discussions in grades 5 to 6. 7 of those states through grade 12, and 4 of the current bills prohibit any discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity all the way through high school, through grade 12. So the breadth of these bills is increasing. The definitions are getting more elusive. The Indiana bill, HB 1608, prohibits instruction in grades K to 3 about sexual orientation, gender identity, gender fluidity, gender roles, gender stereotypes, gender expression. Apparently, they're trying to cover every possible concept or idea that they could think of, and really eliminate any discussion whatsoever.
Well, and when you combine that with the enforcement mechanisms that, like Texas's abortion law, shift the ability to trigger that and those punitive sanctions to individuals on very, very subjective bases that can very well include and, in fact, welcome the same kind of bias, privilege mindset that caused the gap in learning and in all areas in the first place.
Yeah, you'd like to think about the world evolving and our knowledge bases evolving and our world becoming wiser and more thoughtful. And these bills are such a reversal of that. Oklahoma bill, the HB 1780, this is actually a bill that was introduced, says, quote, simply, quote, public schools shall not provide a sex education class, program, test, survey, or questionnaire. That was a bill. That's a bill that's introduced in Oklahoma. That's like, are we going back a century now? It's almost inconceivable that they're so concerned about any discussion that might drift towards sexual orientation or gender identity. Let's just erase it all. Let's go back to the days where you kind of learn about it on the streets from your classmates, and let's see how that plays out. Rather than there's all kinds of health consequences. That a bill with breadth like that is breathtaking. It's just unbelievable that someone would introduce that. And along those lines, kind of shifting over to other kinds of curricular prohibitions and the idea of moving away from just gender identity and gender expression, but over to Black Lives Matter and history of slavery, critical race theory. We've got all kinds of curricular prohibitions being entered in that. Again, Florida being one of the lead states, but not the only state. But basically, states are saying that don't teach anything that doesn't give a positive presentation of American history. You can't do anything that's going to create any sense of anguish or guilt or responsibility, whether conscious or unconscious. You just can't teach it. Everything has to be positive. So if that's the standard, what do you say about American slavery? That it was a good thing? If you got to pitch it as positive. What do you say about Japanese internment? What's going to happen? You don't say anything. If you can only say positive things, and you can't really say positive things about not everything in American history, but certain instances, you're just not going to say anything. So there's going to be gaps in our history classes that lend themselves to kind of the idea, if we don't know our history, it gets repeated. It exposes us to those kinds of problems that unless we understand our errors of the past, we might make them again. And that's something that could happen.
Well, and the other thing that it completely ignores it, young people are going to think about this stuff. They're going to talk about this stuff. They're going to seek answers to really hard questions on this stuff. And to remove our educational system, the people who are trained and qualified to not only explore those subjects, but the whole process of learning how to engage in critical thinking, to investigate issues as objectively as possible, to evaluate them as objectively as possible. That whole opportunity. And the other thing it takes away, which I haven't seen anybody bring up, once you do that, you are now making learning an adversarial process. You are weaponizing and arming people with one set of biases and very, very narrow, privilege-based, elite group-based perspectives, standards, values. And now you've given them the opportunity to trigger and enforce this on a subjective individual basis. Where does it stop?
Yeah, along those lines of this adversarial posturing is that we're seeing that because there are students that are protesting, and they're trying to organize student groups, and they're putting together their signs, and they're marching on the schools because that's their only option. It's like, what else can we do? So instead of being a collaborative process, as you're describing, it becomes more of an adversarial process. We're going to have to fight to read books like Fahrenheit 451, written by Ray Bradbury from my hometown of Waukegan, Illinois, which is a wonderful book about anti-censorship, and it's getting banned around the country because the people who are doing the censorship don't want critiques of censorship being read. And students are saying that that's not the education we want. It's important for us to get exposed to a wide range of ideas at this point in our lives, and we really we want that very much. And if it requires us to be more active, we are. And you're seeing student groups organizing, the kind of anti-censorship groups organizing around the country, and that's encouraging and interesting that they're willing to do that. But it's also discouraging that they have to do that.
And we're seeing that situation tend to feed and reinforce the galvanization and expansion of power in exactly the people who the most manifestly abuse it. One of the things that we saw pop up on the news today is Kevin McCarthy has now appointed Marjorie Taylor Greene as Speaker pro tem for the U.S. House of Representatives when he's away.
Oh my God.
I tend not to agree with the commentator who said it's a brilliant strategy. They will want him there all the time. They'll never want him to leave. They won't even give him pee breaks. But on the other hand, it empowers her in a way and at a time when, if you look at the things that she's been spewing out over the last year, months, and even the last few days. It's scary stuff.
Yeah, 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 it is. The hope is that America, these are extreme positions, and they're also ridiculous. Some of the things she said about, infamous things about the space lasers from Jewish space lasers and, crazy kinds of things. Hopefully, people are paying attention, at least to the degree that they can say, this is insane. It's troubling that we have people in positions of power that have these ideas. And when we vote again, very soon now, elections come, every 2 years in the House, we really need to do something about this. So hopefully the example of that wakes people up. That's the hope.
And that's a really important point to focus on, because we see a situation where right-wing leadership and their followers, and that's millions and millions of people, are doing everything they can to weaponize and arm their positions, their power over the ability of others to learn, to think, to communicate, to express themselves. What can the educational system and the people in it do to disarm those power groups?
Well, one thing is that when we talk about the system, we can talk about it comprehensively. And, school boards have a lot of power. And one thing that can be done in the educational system is to make sure you have a voice and to run for your local school boards and attend your school board's meetings. And even if you're not going to serve on the board, be prepared to comment on their proposed policies. That's certainly one thing we can do. If you have a kind of a parental rights bill in effect in your state, well, get involved in that decision-making process as to who's making the decisions about what's going to be permitted in your libraries, what's your curriculum going to look like. Even if you don't have power to change that legislation right now, and again, keep it in the back of your mind, you do have power to do that with your elected representatives with your vote. But today, tomorrow, you can be involved in that discussion when they're talking about book number 1 and whether or not that one's going to be put behind the counter or not on reserve, whether it's going to be banned completely. You can do that. So there are opportunities within our education system for us to have an impact on what's being done, but it requires engagement.
No, and that's a really focal point, because as critical as it is for students, teachers, young people, all people, to stand up, speak out, to make their voice heard, and to engage themselves, and to take on authorities and responsibilities where that voice will reach people and have meaning and effect, that they're doing that in a time when that's under direct assault and siege. I mean, it's the Eastern Ukraine of our educational system.
Yeah, and if you want to go global, Al Jazeera had an interesting article in January, a couple months ago, that the U.S. is inspiring education censorship elsewhere. And it's an interesting article because it kind of talks about U.S. is supposed to be the beacon of democracy, and the beacon of freedom. And it says that, that's not what the world is seeing right now. That's not what the world is hearing. And they're taking America's lead. And the article kind of goes around from Hungary to Turkey to the United Kingdom and to Russia, with its recent LGBTQ plus legislation, saying other countries are looking what we're doing and saying that, well, if the beacon of democracy thinks doing this is okay, we can do it too. And it kind of walks around and looks at some of the recent legislation in countries around the world that are limiting, that are censorship oriented. And so what we're doing doesn't affect just us. It's affecting the globe. And people take our lead. And And again, that's something about which we have to be conscious.
And thanks, David. That's a critical point to understand as well, because taking this direction and making fear, division, bias, and all of those weaponized elements increasingly empowered in our learning system and process and people, it separates us from all of the rest of the world that would most feed the healthiest and the most constructive elements of that learning process and make them available to us. Frankly, right now, if parents of children in Asia or Africa or wherever it may be start to look at the opportunities, Australia, New Zealand, a lot of other places are going to look a lot more attractive than the US for the learning experience. And that hurts us immeasurably, because so much of the most valuable elements, so many of the most valuable elements of our scientific, educational, and other forms, healthcare and other areas of service and leadership, have come from attracting people from all over the world. And we now have the Florida guys actually directly attacking diversity, equity, and inclusion itself.
We benefit from that influx, but we also benefit from the outflow also. When people come from different parts of the world, and particularly we had students from China who come, and I've had students that I was sponsor for our Asian American Law Students Association, who early on, we invite them to our home. I have dinner with them and barbecues. And there have been times when I've heard them say to each other, "Don't talk, you can't talk about that," early in the semester. And maybe by a year later, they have opened up and they're willing to have discussions they never had before. So if people are interested and attracted to come to the United States and experience the kind of freedom that we want to retain, they can take that back. That's a implicit kind of export of freedom. You're not trying to, externally, aggressively overturn a government. It's not necessarily subversive, but it's real. The idea that if people come here and experience more freedom than they do in their countries, they'll take that back, and maybe we can spread democracy and freedom that way. So to the degree that our education system isn't offering that, they're not going to bring it back, and I think that's a real cost.
And what a healthier, saner, more humane direction that is. A friend gave me an example recently. He said, "Look, Chuck, if you got the greatest scientists in the US and the West and China, Japan, and Asia and the rest of the world together, they would put first, how do we best understand, take, for example, South China Sea, EC, whatever you want to call it, how do we best understand this environment and its resources, how to manage them, how to develop and protect them, how to allocate and share them in the ways that will have the greatest global benefit for each and all of us collectively possible."
Yes.
That's what education at its best reminds us, guides us to, and offers. And
yes,
the war on that is dangerously frightening.
Yeah. As we're kind of winding down here, there's one other bill I wanted to point out. South Carolina is a HB 3779 introduced by a Democrat, and what it says is that history school teachers will be prohibited from offering any instruction about persons who owned slaves. Now, this is not a bill that they really want to pass, but it's a bill intended to kind of point out the hypocrisy that, if you're so concerned about exposing students to slavery. Well, you maybe can't talk about all the white men that that you want to praise who turns out they owed slaves because they arguably fall in the definition of what's prohibited. So let's take it even further. And let's say we're not talking about anybody in American history who ever owned slaves, and if that's what you want. So the sponsor says very clearly this is intended to point out the hypocrisy of some of the people authoring these prohibitive censorship bills. And I thought that was an interesting effort to kind of point out how and really, if you think objectively and take the emotion out, how kind of ridiculous some of these attempts are. I mean, they're very scary. They threaten me so ridiculous. It's not really the appropriate word, but extreme maybe is a better word. You put a bill in like this that hopefully underscores how extreme some of these proposals are that are kind of racing around the country.
Well, that's a great place to wrap us up for today. We're out of time. But thanks for bringing us back to the understanding that at its best, education offers us not only our best, but maybe in some senses our only opportunity to really bring together our best elements collectively and collaboratively to generate the best choices and consequences for us, our children, and our future. David Larson, thanks so much for your insights, perspectives, and the learning that you've shared with us today. ThinkTech Hawaii, aloha. Rejoin us next time we're back, and we'd love to have you with us.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.